Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recipe for Reality Small Bites, where I take a topic in the Survivor realm and break it down in a top 10 list, or otherwise stated, a numbered list or ranking. This week, I tried to, obviously always correlate the episodes of these to the episodes of Survivor we're currently watching, and we took a big hit, and by we I mean the EDGIC community. And if you don't know what the EDGIC community is, basically it's a combination of the words edit and logic. It's basically trying to assess the logic of this edit process, and I think it's interesting when we talk about the edit of Survivor, we're not necessarily talking about the editing of Survivor, where things are shown, the way, certain reveals are revealed. That is the editing of Survivor, and the editing of Survivor is amazing and we love it. The edit of Survivor is more about the journeys of these castaways, these characters, and the stories that are told involving what information we receive and what we don't, in terms of also tracking who the winner of the season is going to be. Now, some people like to kind of turn off their brain when it comes to EDGIC and just kind of enjoy the season for what it is and not necessarily try to seek out who the winner is. But for a lot of us in this EDGIC community, we love to kind of look for the clues and the foreshadowing, because that is part of the fun, especially on a first watch of watching Survivor, a new Survivor season, is trying to figure out who the winner is going to be. And this week, we took a huge, massive blow. And if you haven't watched the episode yet, spoiler alert, because I am going to bring up her name, but we did 3, 2, 1 lose Jem this week, who was, I would think, either the top or in the top 3 EDGIC contenders for this season. Now, assessing a winner's edit is very difficult because it does vary. There are exceptions to the rules, obviously, and that's kind of what this episode is going to highlight, is the top 10 times where the edit just totally blindsided us. But I do think, for the most part, at least by the end of a season, we're able to tell at least who the top contender is to win the game, and usually the season goes by the predictable route of that person winning or that person losing and being taken out by the eventual winner, who is usually the number 2 or number 3 most likely person to win. Very rarely do we have someone who is never on the radar to win the game, and we will talk about a few of those exceptions in a little bit. But I think it's very interesting this past episode, seeing Jem, who was literally one of the top winner EDGIC contenders, lose not just in the game period, but in the pre-merge especially. I mean, that is kind of the big shocker, is that she went out as early as she did, because sometimes you have EDGIC contenders who, by the time they go home, they lose a little bit of steam, and then you're like, oh, okay, yeah, they were like 7th or 8th place, kind of like Shan from Survivor 41. But I think for Jem, she was just heating up, and her winner's edit was just taking off, to where I think it was a big shock for all of us, which is what inspired this video. Now, before I get into my actual ranking of my top 10, I wanted to talk about what kind of constitutes a winner's edit. What do people look for? And I have a few examples to bring, because I think there are some winners that are very obvious from the beginning. Someone like Kim Spradlin, for example, on One World, is someone who from the very first episode, everyone's like, oh, she's probably going to win, and then she ends up winning the whole thing. Then you have people who come out of complete nowhere to win, which I won't say because they'll probably be on this list. But then you have the people who maybe the casuals aren't necessarily looking at as the biggest person on the season, or the most, recognizable, the most notable, but the EDGIC community has them as a top contender. And I think that's kind of where the separation is. And the best example I can think of is Survivor Co Wrong, which is not going to be on this list, because while the casual viewers probably thought Aubrey was going to win because she was just kind of driving the strategy of that season and she was very present, I think a lot of the EDGIC community had Michelle at the number 1 contender spot for most of the season because of the trends and tropes we see in the edits. Now, was Michelle the main character of the season? No, it probably was Aubrey or even Ty, but Michelle had the different elements that make up a winner's edit that someone like Aubrey or even Ty didn't even have, to where if you watch that season, there are some big hints and clues as to why Michelle won. And I think that's really where the EDGIC community kind of took off, was when Co Wrong was airing, because there was such a disparity between, the casual viewers who were completely blindsided by Michelle's win, and then the EDGIC community who totally saw Michelle's win coming from a mile away. And I think since then, people have really started to hone in on this winner's edit and really see where the holes are for the bigger contenders and where the potential, little bits of foreshadowing are for the ones that maybe aren't as visible in the season. So let's just go through some of the staples of a winner's edit. First off, the winner's quote, which you usually get in the premiere, either by a mat chat with Jeff, which is basically where you're standing on the mat being asked questions. I mean, the past few seasons, almost every winner has gotten a mat chat. Erica, Gabler, Marianne, they've all gotten mat chats. But a winner's quote in general, and this is something we see with a lot of winners, where they'll just say something pretty generic usually, usually, where it's like, oh, I'm here to take everyone down and then I'll be the last one standing. But really, those are things to read into, because a lot of these winners have those winners quotes. Also, just unnecessary positive content. And I think we see this most of all with like someone like Dee last year, where she got that whole segment about her big toe, when that was completely unnecessary for the overall story of the season. But now seeing that she won, I mean, that was a big reason why people put her high on the editor contender list, because it was unnecessary positive content. Whenever the show goes out of their way to give someone positive content is a very good sign. It's something we also saw with Michelle a lot of the time, especially with like Caleb's medevac. Michelle spoke on it more than anyone else on her tribe, when you would expect someone like Ty to. Then you have a pretty easy one, which is like pretty good reads. Usually the edit doesn't like to show their winner in a wrong light. You know, they don't usually like to show the times the winner is wrong. Now, that person might be wrong on the beach, but the show won't tell us that they're wrong. They'll usually only show the winner having good reads. And with that, I think they also have other players talking about their threat level. This is also important. That we saw this with Dee last year as well, where a lot of the other castaways would say, well, if Dee gets to the end, she's going to win, or Dee's a big threat we might have to look out for, but they never quite go through with the plan, you know. And I think that's something you see in a lot of winners edits, is a lot of people talking about how good of a player the winner is, rather than the winner themselves talking about how good a game they're playing. If someone is talking about how good they are in the game, chances are they're not your winner. But if someone else is saying, well, this person's a big social threat, or this person's a big strategic threat, that could be a key indicator that they are the winner. Another one is confessionals. Now, confessionals are a little different, especially with these 90-minute episodes nowadays, but usually the winner will get at least one confessional in every episode, just because it's important, if you're going to win the season, that you have a presence throughout the season. And most winners don't get 0 confessional episodes. Now, some do, so that is an exception of the rule for some people, but a lot of the time it kind of goes hand in hand with the unnecessary positive content. Usually the winner will say something on the episode to the camera, whether it be a very small snippet of a very unnecessary kind of side mission or segment, or they do talk a lot about their strategy to the camera. But either way, there is a consistent presence. We very rarely see an invisible episode for a winner, but it has happened, and we will talk about it. Also, kind of in line with the winner's quote, but all winners usually have a good premiere and a good merge episode, especially the merge episode, because this is where you kind of get all the different relationships that are going to play out for the rest of the season. You know, you're going to get to see people, you know, interact with people they haven't interacted with on the season yet. So I think a good premiere, but especially a good merge episode, is something to really look for in a winner's edit. And we saw that with a lot of winners. You know, they have kind of the upper hand when it comes to the merge. And then the last thing is the over-the-top personalities rarely win. Usually if you're an over-the-top personality, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're wild and crazy, but over-the-top in terms of the edit, like you're getting 10 plus confessionals in 2 or more episodes, you know, you're really driving so much of the strategy to where it feels like it's your season. I mean, there's a pretty big glaring example that I will talk about on this list of someone who I called off from very early on the season, because I'm like, how in the world is this person going to win when they're so visible? Now, there is obviously one exception. There was only one over-the-top winner in the history of Survivor, which we'll get to because they're also on the top 10 list. But usually there's no over-the-top personalities that go on to win the game. So for this season, especially, like Banu was never going to win because he was such an over-the-top character. Now, that's not to say they don't make the final tribal council and lose. We've seen that happen a bunch, where the over-the-top personalities make it to the end but then don't win. But very rarely do we see someone who wins the game be over the top, because I don't think the edit wants you to be overwhelmed by them or wants you to be tired of them. I think they want to give some sort of mystery, so they don't over-edit these people, which is important. So a winner's quote, unnecessary positive content, other players talking about their threat level, pretty good reads, a confessional almost every episode, good premiere and merge episodes, and not an over-the-top personality. That's kind of what we're looking for in a winner's edit. So let's get into now the top 10 times the Edgic blindsided us, the viewer. And I will say right now, I'm not going to include Edge of Extinction, just because that is such a weird circumstance where literally half the players were on a beach, you know, just waiting to return back to the game. Like, there was really no way to edit Chris as the winner of that season in a way that fit this winner's convention. And then same with Heroes, Healers, Hustlers, because the fire-making twist kind of complicates the edit there, to where I think going into the finale, most people thought Devin was going to win, or even Chrissy, or maybe even Ryan. Like, I don't think Ben was on people's radars. But again, we didn't know this fire-making thing would happen. And I think if we had known that there was a potential for fire-making, maybe we would have considered Ben as more of a likely winner's option. So I think that's more of a game thing, you know, kind of throwing us off rather than the edit itself. So let's get into our top 10. I'm starting it off with someone who I think looking back at this season, it becomes clear why this person doesn't win and why the person who does win, has a much bigger presence in the season. But this is someone who was the top contender headed into the merge and then went out at the merge with 2 idols. It is Kelly Kim from Island of the Idols. Now, obviously, Kelly was going to be a big personality because of all the stuff that went down with He Who Must Not Be Named. And I think that's why she got so much visibility, but she was never really a completely over-the-top character. She had found 2 idols, which made people, really put her high on the estimations of an EDGIC winner contender. And the thing is, going into the merge episode, like I said, she was the top contender. It wasn't Tommy, and I think the reason is because Tommy was almost too perfect. Tommy was kind of just really playing one of the most clean, consistent games. I almost said safe, but it wasn't really a safe game. He played a really good floater strategy, almost similar to like Andy Herons and BB15. I guess it's a thing with redheads, but like this kind of very consistent in the middle game where he never really found idols. He never really had these huge advantages, but he just kind of slipped through based on his social bonds because he's just that social and strategic of a guy. But I think at the time people thought because it was so positive and it was so consistent and there were really no big spikes one way or the other, positively or negatively, I think people were looking at Tommy as perhaps the decoy winner's edit to someone like Kelly. But then as soon as the merge hits, and obviously again there were weird circumstances, that merge episode is the worst episode in the history of Survivor, not just because of the bad stuff that goes on, but also because Kelly goes home with 2 idols and she was the top contender, and I think it devastated a lot of people. And I do think Kelly is someone that just everyone was very shocked to see go home as early as she did. And I think for the rest of the season, it's very clear Tommy's going to win. But up until that point, I think it really was, is it going to be Kelly or is it going to be Tommy? So when Kelly went out as early as she did, I think it was a big shock to a lot of people. And then kind of continuing along this train, I do have Tiffany from Survivor 41 at number 9. This is another one where I think the EDGIC community was much more on the boat of Tiffany winning this game than like the casuals were. But here's the thing with Tiffany is that she is an over-the-top personality, but the show didn't show her as an over-the-top personality. So a lot of people in the EDGIC community were saying, well, if she's being shown to be this more complex person and this more likable figure, they could have easily given her the crazy, older woman edit, but they didn't. And I think they really tried to show us the humanity of her. And there's one scene that I think a lot of people were thrown off by, which is the turtle scene when her yellow tribe is watching all those little sea turtles go off to the sea, and it's her and it's Xander and it's Evie. And I think a lot of people in that moment thought, oh, well, the winner's definitely going to come from this yellow tribe. And I think Evie was a little too visible, and I think Xander was more circumstantial because of his edits and because of his idols and stuff, to where I think a lot of people settled on Tiffany being the winner of the season. Also because Shan was the over-the-top person. Shan was the person who was very clearly set up to be like the big dragon to be taken down at the end. And I think every season has that one person who's like the big force that you need to take out in order to win the game, to where a lot of people going into that merge episode thought Tiffany was going to win the game, myself included. I thought they were really setting it up for her to have this really great arc to the end, and then she goes out in the merge, kind of in a similar way to Kelly. But it was even more devastating because I think Kelly, at least there was the option where I think Tommy was still a very big winner contender, whereas here, I think the next winner contender after Tiffany was Shan, and even then, I think a lot of people lost faith in Shan winning the game because she was such an over-the-top presence. Like, no one was considering Erica at this point in Survivor 41. So when Tiffany went home, that kind of threw everyone into a frenzy and a tizzy, to where then people had to start looking at the other people and seeing who would have won. Maybe it would be Ricard, or maybe it would be Erica, or maybe we would even see Deshawn or Xander pull it out. And I think that's a really interesting, case, also because it was the first season of this new era. So we all were kind of thrown for a loop, and it kind of made us reassess what the winner's edit kind of was going forward for the next few seasons. At number 8 is someone very recent. It's the most recent. It's Jem, and I want to talk a little bit more about Jem, just because I think Jem, the big thing for me with Jem was the winner's quote. I mean, in episode 1, they didn't do any mat chats. It was all kind of these backstory personal montages, and Jem literally said a line like, I'm gonna, enjoy watching everyone cut each other left and right, and then I'm gonna be the one sitting at the end as the sole survivor. It was such a winner's quote that from that moment I was like, she's winning. Like, I was totally convinced in that winner's quote alone. But then the episodes actually did a good job in making her content consistent, even though her tribe didn't go to tribal council for the next 2 or 3 episodes. We still got her perspective on everything, but we weren't force fed it. And then when she found the idol, I was like, oh yeah, she's gonna win, just because she's getting really good personal content, she's getting really good consistent content while also not being over the top. Because Yanu was such an over the top tribe that I just thought Jem was sitting pretty in the middle. She was never really being the focus of the Siga tribe while also still being there. She had a cool nickname, which is something we see a lot of the time. Like if there's something that the audience can remember you by, it's a good sign. And she got that Jungle Gem kind of nickname thrown at her. I just really thought Jem was gonna be one of these endgame players, maybe the fire-making loser, but I thought she was at least destined to make the finale. So to see her go out, and again, pre-merge was so shocking. The only reason I don't have her higher on this list is because it is so new, and I think once we know who the winner is gonna be, I think we're gonna be able to look back at the season and be like, okay, maybe that's where we should have seen this coming or that coming. But right now, I don't really know who the top contender is, because I would have said it was Jem, and now that Jem is gone, who really left is a huge contender. It's hard because a lot of people have these different holes. Like, for example, Venus, I think, has a great kind of arc set up for her to kind of take down the other members of her tribe. She's got this underdog edit, but the problem is she had a zero confessional episode, and she was invisible for an episode, which makes me think, oh, maybe Venus isn't winning. And then you have someone like Tevin, same thing. Tevin's a big personality, but he had a zero confessional episode. And then you have someone like Yanu. Any of those 3 on Yanu could win, but again, they've been so visible that are they considered over the top? To where I've really kind of narrowed it down in terms of winner contenders to 2 people, which is Kenzie and Ben. I did just say Yanu was very visible, but I do think Kenzie, at least, a lot of people have been saying how big a threat she is, and it kind of reminds me of D, where it's like, if we don't get Kenzie out now, she's going to win it. And I think that could have been a foreshadowing, kind of like what we saw with D, or like we saw with like even Sandra on her season, where it's like, well, we got to get her out. Okay, we're gonna let her slide through. And then also Ben, just because Ben also kind of got that thing last week where everyone was talking about how social of a threat he is, and how he's like this big social threat, and if he gets to the end, he could really win. I think this is going to be one of those seasons where the winner edit is going to be very hard to determine, especially with Jem out now. But I've kind of settled on Kenzie and Ben being the 2 top contenders, but even then, like, I really don't even know if those 2 are going to win. Maybe it's Hunter, but I think Hunter's just a little too front and center right now, and he's too big a threat. We don't usually see these big macho guys win, but I don't know. Jem took me by surprise, so she's here at number 8. At number 7, my number 7 through 4 are all going to be winners who blindsided us, in the fact that we didn't see their wins coming. And the first one, now in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense just because of who they are in the Survivor legacy, but at the time, this was a huge shocker for people, and that is Tony from Cagayan winning the game. Tony was the only over-the-top winner in the history of the game. Every single season, the winner has not been an over-the-top presence. Tony is the only person to be over-the-top in terms of his edgic on the edgic charts. And I think it's because when you have a winner like Tony, you have to seize that opportunity to make him the biggest personality of that season. I think this really was one of those unicorn anomaly type edits, but if you look at the edgic contenders week by week, Tony wasn't even in the top 3 for pretty much any week. Even the finale, people thought that Spencer, Wu, and Cass all had a better shot at winning than Tony. Even people thought Cass had a better shot. That's when you know, because Cass was not portrayed super well on the island, but I think people thought her edit was a little bit more complex than Tony's, to where people just assumed, just because we'd never had an over-the-top winner, that Tony just could not win. And I think that's really just a testament to how predictable the edit can be, but also how great of a player Tony is, that he was able to kind of defy this stereotype. And, it's good that the edit didn't dumb down Tony's presence on the season. I'm almost glad they made him over the top, because it also made it a great surprise for the edgic community when he did win. But it was a surprise nonetheless, and I think also the fact that it was a final 2, not a final 3. I do think a lot of people going into the finale probably predicted it to be like Spencer or Wu, just based on some of the positivity they got throughout the season. But really, I would have said up until the finale, I think Trish was probably the biggest bet, because she was always kind of like the second in command to Tony. So Tony was driving a lot of the strategy and a lot of the gameplay, but Trish was always the one kind of getting the more winners edit. And even before her, I mean, LJ was looked at as a potential winner. Even Sarah Lacina was looked at as a potential winner in until her boot. So I think that's one of those crazy seasons where it's not really one particular contender losing, like Sarah or LJ or Spencer or Wu. I think it's more so Tony winning, which was a blindside to a lot of people. Now, for the casuals, it might not have been a blindside because everyone's like, yeah, Tony dominated that game. But for the Edgic community, it was very, very shocking because no one had ever seen someone so present in the edit win a game of Survivor. At number 6, kind of continuing along with the winners trend, we have Adam from Millennials vs. Gen X. Now, I know Adam, once Final Tribal happened, we all knew Adam was going to win, and he was probably going to sweep just because of his amazing Final Tribal performance. But going into that finale and kind of throughout the whole season, Adam wasn't necessarily looked at as a top contender. And I think the biggest reason why is because he had a disastrous merge episode. If we don't remember, the merge episode of Millennials vs. Gen X is the whole situation with Taylor stealing the food and Adam kind of partaking in that. And Adam had a really bad merge episode to where ever since the merge episode, people just wrote him off as a winner. Everyone thought that the top contenders were going to be David or Jay, and if not David or Jay, then it was probably going to be Hannah, which is why going into the finale, everyone assumed that Adam had the 4th best chance to win. Still a higher chance than like Brett and Ken, but I think a lot of people were surprised when they saw the final 3 that Adam was going to win the season just because his merge episode was that bad. But not even his merge episode, but the Mari boot in episode 2, the first tribal the Millennials go on, Adam is also blindsided with Zeke. So I think that's also a tell that, a lot of people weren't predicting Adam to be the winner of the season. Now, people probably thought he was going to go far and be a big character on the season and be a big presence, but I think Adam winning just showed that, sometimes these winners just make bad moves, and sometimes the show just has to show those bad moves because it was such an integral part to the story, to where I think the edit didn't really know how to edit around that and how to spin that into a positive. Now, the good thing with Adam is he still does have so much personal content. I mean, obviously the story with his mom, and he was shown, at least at the end of the game, to have pretty good reads, especially over Hannah, even though the edit, I think, made Hannah out to look a lot worse than she actually was on the island. I think Adam, the edit showing us that Adam was calling Hannah kind of dumb for letting David get that far, I think was a tell at the very end that Adam was going to win. But up until that finale, I don't think anyone thought Adam was going to win, solely because his merge episode was that bad, and because you had people like David and Jay who were such other likely winner contenders still in the game. I mean, that is a finale where really I think anyone but Ken could have won. I even think Brett could have won, depending on who he's sitting next to in the case he makes to the jury. So I really think Millennials vs. Gen X is just an overall very well edited season, but that also makes for a very surprising winner. At number 5, probably a name you all expected to see, one of the most surprising winners, especially of this new era, which is Mike Gabler. Now, Gabler winning is just such a complete shock. But I do think if you watch back the season, there are some clues there for a winner's edit, especially the whole Gabler thing. It kind of reminds me of the Jungle Gem thing, where it's like, when you get this whole like little nickname thing, I guess that was shown to be a positive, even though I saw it always as like kind of like a jokey, like, oh, we can't really take this man too seriously. But I think the main reason why we should have seen Gabler's win coming in retrospect is because of that merge episode where he's able to get Ellie out. Gabler has a really good merge episode, and I think that's something that we all didn't really take into account, is that his biggest opponent went out at the merge, and I think the whole pre-merge was kind of focused on that relationship, to where when he wins that battle, we should have kind of seen it coming. But that aside, everything else would never point toward a Gabler win. I think Cassidy had all the personal content, kind of had that hero's journey. I think Jesse was kind of the big dragon, like I talked about with Shan, where it's like whoever cut Jesse was going to win. And the thing is, Cassidy essentially put Jesse in a fire, so she was technically the one to cut Jesse, but the problem is Gabler is the one to go into fire against Jesse, so maybe Gabler was given that credit. It's just such a weird edit, because I think it was more so the show trying to show us why Jesse and Carla lost the game, rather than why Gabler won. Not even as much Cassidy, because I think even Cassidy winning the game would have been a little surprising, but given the final 3, I think Cassidy was clearly the favorite between Owen, Gabler, and Cassidy. But Gabler's win just, took everyone by surprise, to where if you look at the Edgic charts, no one had Gabler in the top spot going into the finale, at least not the consensus. I think everyone had him at like number 2, because I think everyone just assumed that Carla and Jesse were going to get out before the finale, but I think a lot of people had Cassidy in the top spot, myself included, because she had the more conventional winner's edit, especially how her story kind of picked up at the merge with her and her sister and how she was fighting for her sister, and she kind of had that thing where every time one of her kind of enemies went home, she kissed her necklace, which reminded her of her sister. I mean, all those things that made me think that Cassidy was going to run away with it, only for Gabler to come in and kind of take everyone by surprise, was quite shocking. At number 4, we have someone that is kind of the OG surprising winner. This is the person that everyone at the time was like, WTF. And I think it's even more complex because I don't even think the runner-up was the very clear winner either, because they were so over the top. And this is Natalie White from Samoa. Now, the reason this is such an interesting Edgic blindside is not that, I mean, Natalie winning, yes, is a big surprise. The thing is, Russell losing was not a big surprise. Like I talked about earlier, no over-the-top person has ever won, and Russell is, by the numbers, the most over-edited person in the history of Survivor, where he got so many confessionals, he broke records, he still holds records, I believe, for the most confessionals in a single season by ratio, and I do think going into the finale, I think everyone kind of assumed Russell was going to lose, and that's kind of what the edit was setting up, because he was so present that I don't think people assumed he would win. I think it was going to be one of those things where people thought he was going to either get out in 4th place and be like that robbed goddess, which is kind of weird to talk about with Russell, but either be that robbed goddess or make it to the end and lose, which he did. I think at the very, very end, people were like, well, I guess he's going to win, right? And it was going to be one of those Tony things. But the thing is, the edit is so weird to where the real winner contender throughout the season, and I looked back at all the Edgic charts, was actually Mick, which now, if you look in retrospect, makes no sense because Mick played a pretty, I mean, not great game. But if you look through the season and you actually watch the season, looking at Mick as a potential winner contender, I think he has a few more glimmers of winner potential than someone like Natalie does. I think he has a winner's quote in the first episode. He is shown as the leader of this underdog tribe. He is shown as the leader of Foa Foa. He has a confessional almost every episode. He does have some good reads. People talk about him like he's this likable kind of Captain America-like guy. I mean, he has a pseudo winner's edit to where I think a lot of people going into the finale thought if Brett loses, because I mean, come on, Brett was barely in the edit, so they probably knew a Foa Foa was going to win. But if a Foa Foa was going to win, it was probably going to be Mick. But then when you get to Final Tribal and Mick is getting just ripped apart, then I think the audience was like, is Russell actually going to win? But then they were like, maybe it's going to be Natalie. I think the pairing here is the fact that Russell was such an anti-winner because of how visible he was, and Natalie was such an anti-winner based on how invisible she was, where like everyone kind of just settled on assuming Mick was going to be the winner, which makes it one of the most bizarre blindsides ever because, Mick ends up getting 0 votes. It was just such a weird Final Tribal, such a weird edited season just because Russell dominated so much of the screen time, to where I'm wondering if they were to edit that season now, I think we would have seen a lot more Natalie White upside and maybe a lot less Russell when we didn't need to see him, because that's the thing with Russell is they showed him when he was relevant to the storyline, when he wasn't relevant to the storyline, and when he was only partially relevant. The thing with Natalie is they barely showed her. I mean, if you're going to look at one thing that helped Natalie's winners edit, it's the scene with her killing the rat, because that was kind of like her personal content, almost like D with her foot. That was kind of the unnecessary positivity that they show for a winner, but that's really the only clue to show that Natalie might win this game. I think this season was much more about Russell losing than it was Natalie winning. But this top 3 is really the times where I was just so stunned I couldn't even speak when these people went home. And at number 3 and 2, I'm going to put them together because they're part of the same season, and that is Josh and Jeremy from San Juan del Sur. And the reason I put them together is because this whole pre-merge, they are the 2 main characters. I mean, it's them and like John Rocker, but let's be honest, John Rocker wasn't going to win. John Rocker was a main character because he was the villain of the season, but Josh and Jeremy were shown to be these kind of 2 rivaling opponents. They kind of had their own numbers. It was very clearly brewing to where one of them would take out the other and win the game. And we thought, just as an Edgic community, that it would probably go on to maybe like Final 7 or Final 6, where these 2 guys are standing there, and then eventually Jeremy would either beat Josh or Josh would beat Jeremy. But instead, it happens all the way at the merge, really early in the game, and Josh gets taken out. And I think people were surprised because Josh was a more likely winner than Jeremy. But once Josh went home, everyone was like, okay, so Jeremy's winning, because it was kind of one of those things where if Jeremy's able to take out Josh, then he's going to win the game. It's kind of like with Wendell and Dom and Chris Noble. As soon as Dom takes out Chris Noble at the merge, everyone knew Dom was going to probably get to the end, and that was going to be his winning story. Kind of also like Gabler and Ellie in a way. But the very next episode after Josh goes, Jeremy gets blindsided by John. So it's one of those things where it's like, we had two winner contenders, one lost to the other, so we assumed the other was going to go on to steamroll it to the end, and then they're out in the very next episode. And then eventually Natalie's edit does pick up, because then we see her kind of go on this revenge tour, avenging Jeremy and then winning the game, which is, I think, one of the coolest edited winners edits I've ever seen. If you go back and watch that season, knowing that Natalie eventually gets revenge for Jeremy, it's almost like a Game of Thrones thing, where we're watching the first season, and then when Ned Stark gets beheaded, we're like, wait, what? Ned's done? He's dead? And then it's like, oh, because this is more about Arya's story and Sansa's story and, Jon Snow's story and who's the other brother? Robb Stark, I think is his name, right? The Red Wedding? I don't know. But it's one of those things where it's like, once Josh went out, we thought it was going to be Jeremy, but once Jeremy went out, it then became clear it was Natalie. But if you were to tell me at the merge, going into the merge, that Natalie was going to win and it wasn't going to be Josh or Jeremy, I would have probably been very surprised. And if you had told me that the next two boots were going to be Josh and Jeremy in that order, I would have been just flabbergasted. And I think everyone was kind of flabbergasted, but that's what makes for a very entertaining season and a very entertaining winner trajectory for Natalie. But really, there was no other winner contenders going into that merge, because those two were so visible, but not over the top in a way that like John Rocker was. But very clearly the drivers of those strategies and those different sides, to where I think it's one of the most interesting ways of depicting blindsides and winners edits in Survivor history. But at number one, this should be an obvious. If you've watched every season, you know what I'm probably going to say, because there's one season where the most obvious winner dominates the pre-merge, only to go out pre-jury. It's Marcus from Gabon. Marcus had the cleanest, most consistent, most dominant winners edit I have ever seen, only to go out kind of in a similar way to Jem of this previous season, where he goes out right before the merge. But the difference is, even with Jeremy and Josh, it was clear that Natalie then was the successor. Even with Jem, there are still people I think could win the game. Even with Kelly getting out, we still knew Tommy was going to go on to win after that. Here, when Marcus goes home, we're left with a group that includes Susie Smith, Bob Crowley, Maddie, who was fairly quiet to that point, Charlie and Corinne, who were Marcus's closest allies, who weren't going to win, Randy, who wasn't going to win, and then that we were kind of left with assuming Ken would win, but I just never bought Ken being the winner of that season just based on the winner's edit, because he had some moments where he was shown to be wrong. This was one of the weirdest edited seasons ever, and I think it's because Marcus was such a glaring, obvious winner that when he went home, I think we all were just kind of stunned. We didn't really know what to say, because there was no real runner-up contender. If you look at the contenders going into the merge, I guess people thought Kenny could win, people thought Maddie could win, but really there was no one reaching Marcus at that point. So when Marcus went out, I mean, I think that's what makes Gabon such an interesting season and such an entertaining season, is because there really is no way to predict the winner. So much so to where the finale happens, and Kenny goes out, everyone's like, who's going to win now? Because it probably wasn't going to be Maddie, just because I feel like Maddie just doesn't have that winner's edit. I thought it could have been Sugar, but Sugar wasn't getting a winner's edit. Maybe, and I guess maybe Susie was the favorite going into the finale, but that's weird. When you have someone like Susie as the favorite going into the finale, I mean, that's when you know the season has been edited in a very weird way. But again, it is a very weird season, and it's why it's such an entertaining one. But I think Marcus is one of those just grade A examples of, like, he's almost too perfect. It's kind of like the vibes I'm getting of Hunter on this current season, where he's almost set up to be such a good player and such a perfect player that eventually he's going to have a downfall. Otherwise, it's going to be like a Kim Spradlin thing or Tommy Sheehan thing, where they just go on a cruise to the end of the game, or Tom Westman even. And I think if there is someone that season, it is Hunter, where if Hunter does just win the game, I guess this is the edit they're going to give him. But I think Marcus is just kind of that one person that kind of created a lot of fear in future seasons, where if you're the golden boy, you're probably not going to win, which is very interesting considering JT happened right around this time as well. And he was kind of the Marcus, where he was the golden boy who cruised to the end and won unanimously. So I think it just goes to show the kind of caliber of players of Gabon and the kind of mayhem that ensued, that someone like Marcus, who was so clearly the winner of that season, went out not just late in the game by a shocking blindside, but went out at the merge, or at the pre-merge even. I think that was just so shocking. And that gif that we've all seen where like everyone looks so stunned and Maddie's smiling, that's because of the Marcus blindside. I think everyone was genuinely shocked, the players alike, because up until that point, the other players were even talking about how much they wanted Marcus to win. Like, Corinne was like talking about how she wanted Marcus to win. Charlie wanted Marcus to win. Randy wanted Marcus to win. Like, all these people really genuinely loved Marcus and wanted to get Marcus to the end, knowing they would lose to him. That just goes to show how crazy of a blindside that was to the Edgic community and to the casuals. I think that's the difference between this blindside and any others, is that at least in some other blindsides, the casuals aren't as blindsided by it. Like, I talked to my family on Easter Sunday brunch, and a lot of them were kind of foreseeing Gem's downfall because they were like, she was playing too hard, she was hiding the beware advantage, yada yada yada, to where I was like, oh, but she was getting such a winners at it, and they were like, we never thought she was going to win, and I think that just goes to show sometimes the casuals are more, susceptible to pick up these blindsides because they're not really overanalyzing the edit. Whereas someone like Marcus is someone that I think casuals and Edgic community people alike thought was going to win the game. And so when he goes out, it was quite a blindside. So there we go. There are 10 times where the edits just completely caught us off guard. If you agree with my picks, let me know in the comments below. What were some of the most shocking Edgic blindsides for you, both winners or boots and blindsides? And who is your winner pick for 46? Because I really have no idea. Right now, I've narrowed it down to maybe Kenzie or Ben, with my kind of hope prediction being Venus winning the game. But really, it's hard to assess because rarely do we get a winner who gets every single one of these kind of, trademark winners edit staples correct. Usually there's one glaring omission for each winner. Either they didn't have a confessional in every episode, or maybe they had one bad read, or like Adam, they had a bad merge episode. So I think there's always holes to poke with every player's edit, but that's what makes Survivor so fun. So if you want to get more into the winner's edit, I hope this kind of set up an interesting way of looking at the winner's edit, and maybe when you go back and watch something like Survivor Go Wrong, you'll see that Michelle is actually a pretty obvious winner if you assess the edit. And then when you look at seasons like Samoa or Survivor 43 or even Millennials vs. Gen X, you can see why their wins are more surprising, even though they are still now, when you rewatch it, with the winner in mind, it might be a little easier to tell. But this was a lot of fun. I love talking about the edit on Survivor because it drives me absolutely crazy in a good way. So thank you so much for watching, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or the podcast, whatever you're listening on. And go check out Recipe for Reality, our main show where we talk about the Survivor episodes. We had a lot to say last night about Gem, about her playing, and of course about Maria's extra vote. So please check that video out, and stay tuned for next week where I will have another Survivor themed episode for you. Stay tuned. See ya.